There are moments in life you never forget, moments that seem ordinary at first but carve themselves into your memory forever. For me, it was a quiet family dinner. My father placed his hand on my brother's shoulder, looked at me with a proud smile, and said, "Your brother will take over now." And just like that, everything changed. I felt my stomach drop, but I didn't flinch. I had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of composure. In my family, showing emotion was a weakness, and weakness had no place in business. 12 years. I had spent 12 years turning Harper and Company from a struggling logistics firm into a $75 million industry leader. Late nights, sacrificed vacations, relationships that fell apart under the weight of my ambition. I had given everything to this company, and yet none of it mattered. No discussion, no hesitation, no recognition. Just a decision that had already been made long before that night. Around the table, glasses clinked in celebration. Smiles, congratulations, murmured approval. All directed at my brother, the new heir. The same brother who had never spent a single day running the company. I glanced at my mother across the table. She met my eyes but said nothing. She never did. That night I swallowed the betrayal. I played along, but I knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow morning everything would be different. The next morning I walked into Harper and Company as I had every day for the last 12 years. Same polished floors, same hum of efficiency, same employees nodding politely as I passed. But today was different. Today they had heard the whispers. I could see it in the way they glanced at me, uncertain, hesitant, as if they weren't sure whether to offer condolences or congratulations. I ignored them. I had learned long ago that in this world perception was everything, and today I needed to be unshakable. I entered my office, shut the door, and exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, I felt like a stranger in my own company. My mind flashed back to the beginning, the day my father had reluctantly handed me a position at Harper and Company. I was 24, fresh out of business school, armed with nothing but ambition and a relentless work ethic. Harper and Company was struggling back then, barely surviving, buried under debt, bleeding money. I still remember the first time I saw the financial reports, projected bankruptcy in 18 months. The words were burned into my brain. I had taken those reports home, spread them out across my tiny apartment floor, and spent the entire night studying them. By morning, I had outlined a strategy, one that would turn everything around. But when I presented it to my father, he barely looked at it. "Your job is to assist, not to lead," he had said dismissively. I had nodded, smiled, agreed. Then I went ahead and saved the company anyway. I negotiated contracts that no one thought were possible. I built relationships with suppliers, secured investors, and implemented technology that revolutionized our operations. Year by year, I expanded the company's reach, growing it from a small regional firm into a national powerhouse. My father never acknowledged it, not in words at least, but I had seen the way he relied on me, the way he trusted my judgment, even if he never admitted it. And yet, none of that had mattered, because at the end of the day, he had always intended for my brother to inherit the empire. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. 12 years. 12 years of proving myself, of believing that if I worked hard enough, if I succeeded enough, if I gave everything, he would see me as more than just his daughter. But I had been wrong. That night at dinner, when he placed his hand on my brother's shoulder, he wasn't making a decision. He was announcing one that had been made long before I ever set foot in this office. My jaw tightened. I sat up straight, pulled my laptop toward me, and opened a folder labeled Executive Shareholder Agreements. My father and brother thought this transition would be smooth, that I would quietly step aside, that my position, my influence, my power was temporary. But they had underestimated me. Tomorrow they would realize that I hadn't just spent 12 years running this company. I had spent 12 years securing my place in it. At precisely 9 a.m., there was a sharp knock at my office door. I didn't bother responding. The door swung open, and in walked my father and my brother. My father carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had never been questioned, never been challenged. His suit was immaculate, his movements precise, his confidence unshaken. He had already won in his mind. Ethan followed closely behind, dressed in an expensive navy suit he hadn't earned. His smirk was barely concealed. He thought this was his moment.
I folded my hands on my desk, leaned back slightly, and waited.
Lisa, my father began in that same authoritative tone he had always used when delivering decisions I had no say in. I assume you're aware of the transition happening today? Transition. An interesting choice of words. I'm aware, I said smoothly. My father nodded as if this was a mere formality. Ethan will be stepping in as the new CEO. We'll need you to help with the handover, get him familiar with operations before you officially move on. Move on. I arched an eyebrow, feigning confusion. Move on? My father's patience thinned just slightly. Lisa, this isn't up for debate. We've already made the decision. That's when I smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Oh, I know, Dad. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. The thing is, you don't actually have the authority to make that decision. For the first time that morning, my father's expression faltered. Ethan let out a scoff. Lisa, don't make this difficult. We're trying to do this the easy way. I ignored him and reached for the remote control on my desk. With a single press of a button, the large screen on my office wall lit up, displaying a legal document in bold letters. Executive Shareholder Agreement. Signed, August 17th, 2015. Signatories Lisa Harper, James Harper, Father Ethan Harper. I turned to my brother, my smile widening. Do you even know what this is, Ethan? He crossed his arms, shifting uncomfortably. A shareholder agreement, he muttered. Very good. I nodded. Now, do you know what it says? I tapped the screen, highlighting a crucial clause. It states that any transfer of executive power, such as appointing a new CEO, requires the approval of all majority shareholders. I met my father's eyes, holding his gaze. And I said softly, hold 60% of the company's shares. The silence that followed was suffocating. My father's jaw clenched. Ethan took a step forward, his confidence replaced with panic. That's impossible. Actually, it's very possible. I cut in smoothly. I pulled out a second document. Remember when you needed capital for expansion in 2017? I asked my father. You signed over an additional 15% of your shares to me in exchange for my investment. I turned to Ethan. And in 2019, when we had that legal battle, another 10% was transferred under my name as collateral, which, by the way, Dad, you never bothered reclaiming. I leaned back, letting the weight of my words sink in. That plus my original 35% makes me the majority shareholder. My father's expression hardened. Ethan was outright panicking now. He snatched the paper from my hand, scanning it desperately. You can't do this, he stammered. He turned to my father, his voice rising in desperation. Dad, tell her she can't do this. But my father remained silent, because he knew I had outmaneuvered him. There was nothing he could do. I exhaled slowly, standing up. I'm not firing you, Ethan, I said, my voice steady. I wouldn't want to force you into the real job market. But you will report to me. You will work under my leadership. Otherwise, I gestured toward the door. You're free to leave. Ethan turned to my father, eyes pleading. But for the first time in his life, my father had no answer. Because this wasn't his company anymore. It was mine. Ethan stormed out first. Good riddance. I knew my brother well enough to predict his next move. He would go to our extended family, our father's business associates, painting himself as the victim of corporate betrayal. He would tell them I was power-hungry, that I had planned this all along, that I had stolen what was rightfully his. I didn't care. I wasn't here to win their approval. I was here to win my future. My father lingered in the office for a moment longer. He wasn't a man used to losing. His expression was unreadable, but I knew better. He was calculating. He had spent his entire career in business. He knew that power wasn't just about legal documents, it was about influence, perception, loyalty, and if he couldn't take the company back through legal means, he would do it another way. He finally exhaled, shaking his head. You've changed, Lisa? I met his gaze without blinking. No, Dad, I just finally stopped pretending. He studied me for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. One of acceptance or surrender, I couldn't tell. Then he left. But I knew this wasn't over. By the next morning, the undercurrent of unease within the company was undeniable. Employees who had greeted me with confidence last week now seemed hesitant, as if afraid to pick a side. A few department heads avoided eye contact. The whisper network had begun. I knew exactly what was happening. My father and Ethan were working behind the scenes, calling in favors, meeting with board members, executives, senior investors. They weren't trying to fight me in the boardroom. They were trying to turn the company against me. I could already imagine the conversations over drinks, the hushed phone calls, the subtle manipulations. Lisa is reckless. Lisa is unstable. Lisa isn't a team player. My father wouldn't need to say much at all, just a heavy sigh, a shake of his head, the carefully placed words, I only ever wanted what was best for my children. It was calculated, it was dangerous. Because if he managed to sway the board members and top executives, they could force me out, or, at the very least, make my leadership impossible. I wasn't about to let that happen. That afternoon, I called an emergency executive meeting. When I walked into the boardroom, the tension was thick. Half the room avoided my gaze. The other half watched me too closely, waiting for me to slip. I took my seat at the head of the table. My seat. Let's not waste time, I said, my voice even. I know there have been conversations behind closed doors, over drinks, in hushed voices. I let my gaze move slowly across the room, pausing on each person just long enough to make them shift uncomfortably. I also know that some of you are wondering if my leadership is sustainable. A few people tensed, no one spoke. I tapped my fingers lightly against the polished wood. Let's clear that up now. Behind me, the screen lit up. Numbers, data, facts. I built this company from a struggling regional firm into a $75 million industry leader. Over the last 5 years under my leadership, we've seen a 300% increase in revenue and expanded into 6 new markets. I turned to the CFO. Paul, do we have a single financial indicator suggesting this company is in trouble under my leadership? Paul hesitated, then shook his head. Number. In fact, projections show another 20% growth in the next quarter. I nodded. So let's be honest about what's happening here. I leaned forward slightly. My father and brother aren't upset because the company is struggling. They aren't upset because I'm failing as a leader. I let my words settle. They're upset because they expected me to step aside and let Ethan take over, regardless of qualifications, regardless of results. The room was silent, then I dropped the real bombshell. I also know that some of you have been contacted in the last 24 hours, offered incentives to push for my resignation. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Then, after a long pause, one of the senior executives cleared his throat. I received a call, he admitted, from your father. He said he was considering making an official appeal to the board. I nodded, unsurprised. And did he offer anything in return for your support? Another long pause. Then, a slow nod. There it is. I exhaled, standing up. My father built this company, I said. I won't discredit that, but I took it further than he ever could have. I let my voice drop slightly, controlled, dangerous, and I will not allow him to manipulate it from the outside. I gathered my papers, looking each executive in the eye. If anyone here believes my father and brother deserve control, now is the time to make your move. Silence. No one moved. Good. I turned and walked out, my head held high. This wasn't just about keeping my company. This was about making sure they never thought they could take it from me again. The next morning, my inbox exploded. Emails, missed calls, messages from journalists, investors, board members. Some were supportive, some were cautious, but most of them had one question in common. Is it true? I let them wait. I knew the game my father was playing. For decades, he had mastered the art of public perception. He understood that in business, reputation held weight. If he couldn't defeat me in the boardroom, he would undermine me in the public eye. And that was exactly what he was trying to do. By noon, the first counter-attack arrived. A press release, neatly crafted, carefully worded, but filled with lies. Harper and Company has always been a family-run business. We are saddened by recent developments, but remain committed to upholding the values that built this company. Changes in leadership are inevitable, and we hope to transition smoothly as we move forward. It was subtle, but I knew what it really meant. Lisa is reckless, Lisa is unstable, Lisa is not a team player. I wasn't surprised, I was, however, pissed. On the news, analysts debated my leadership. Is Lisa Harper too aggressive in her takeover? Will her lack of cooperation hurt Harper and Company in the long run? Can she recover from this PR disaster? They spoke about me as if I weren't listening, as if I weren't already planning my next move. Because if my father and Ethan wanted a public war, I was going to give them one. I didn't release a statement, I didn't call a press conference. Instead, I made one phone call to an old friend, an investigative journalist. I have something for you, I said, but you'll need to move fast. An hour later, I sent over documents, emails, financial reports, internal records, evidence that Harper and Company, under my father's leadership, had engaged in questionable business practices over the years, ones I had spent the last decade quietly cleaning up. The news that changed everything. By the next morning, every major business outlet had the same headline: Behind the Scenes at Harper and Company, a legacy of hidden debts and financial cover-ups. The article was brutal. It praised my leadership for fixing the company's financial health. It criticized my father's mismanagement from the past. And most importantly, it proved that I was the only reason Harper and Company had survived. And just like that, the narrative shifted. The board stopped doubting me. The investors stopped hesitating. And my father, he had nowhere to hide. 2 days later, my father finally called me. I let the phone ring 3 times before answering. "Lisa," he said, his voice tight, "we need to talk." I leaned back in my chair. "Do we?" Silence. Then finally, a sigh. "You didn't have to do that." I let out a small laugh. "Neither did you." His voice was quieter now. "This company was supposed to be a legacy for the family, for both of you." I felt a familiar pang in my chest. A tiny, foolish part of me had once wanted that too, but not anymore. "Dad," I said softly, "if you wanted me to protect the legacy, you should have trusted me with it. Instead, you tried to take it from me." Another long silence. Then, finally, he asked almost reluctantly, "What happens now?" I exhaled slowly. "Now? Now, I make sure neither of you can ever touch my company again." The final move. The war was over. My father had lost, Ethan had disappeared, and I had won. But as I sat in my office, staring out over the city skyline, I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just emptiness. I had spent 12 years fighting for Harper and Company, building it, protecting it, making it stronger than ever before. And yet the cost of that victory weighed heavier than I expected, because while I had secured my position, I had lost something else along the way. My family. 1 year later, the company was thriving. The old board members who had aligned themselves with my father and Ethan, gone. The executives who had questioned my leadership, replaced. The company had always been strong under my guidance. But now, it was truly mine. I introduced initiatives my father had rejected, modernized systems he had called unnecessary, expanded into industries he had been too cautious to explore. Within 6 months, profits soared. Within a year, we had crossed the $100 million mark, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just fighting to prove myself. I was fighting to build something that no one could ever take from me again. The final conversation. A year after everything, I met my father for dinner. It was the first time we had spoken since his retirement. He looked different, quieter. He wasn't angry anymore, just accepting. As we sat across from each other, he swirled his drink and said, "I read about the latest deal you closed." I smirked slightly. It was a smart move. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I know." There was no tension between us anymore. No war left to fight. Only the simple, undeniable truth. He had tried to push me aside, and I had proved him wrong. He lifted his glass. To Harper and Company. This time, when I clinked my glass against his, I didn't feel anger, I didn't feel resentment, I just felt peace. Because I had already won, and I no longer needed his approval to know it. Final reflection. As I sit in my office today, overlooking the city I built my empire in, I think about the lessons this journey taught me. That family can be your biggest enemy. That loyalty is a currency, not a guarantee. That power is never given, it's taken. that sometimes the best way to prove your worth is to stop seeking validation and build something so strong that they can never ignore you again. I have no regrets. Harper & Company is mine now, and I intend to make sure no one ever forgets it.